Thanks for making time and being here. So I'm going to talk about a specific paper, but this broader topic of ethical legitimacy of evaluation, and in particular, how it relates to critical systems thinking. So this is the paper. I can make sure everyone has a copy of it if you want it. That was published in Evaluation, I guess, in 2023, but we worked on it for the study itself took over a year and a half of engagement. And there are collaborators who I will talk about during the presentation. But I also want to say that, especially for students on the call, my interest in this topic of ethics began in graduate school, but really even before graduate school. When I get into evaluation, I was really unclear and had my skepticism around, is evaluation really doing good in the world? Is it really contributing? And on what basis, right? Like, what's the legitimacy behind why and how we evaluate? I had come from the nonprofit sector where there was concern that evaluation was done for funders, but not necessarily always serving practitioners and beneficiaries on the ground. And so I'm going to bring that skepticism into the presentation. Stuart already mentioned the two publications. Each of those have some reference and discussion of what I'll talk about in terms of critical systems as it intersects with ethics. And then also over the last couple of years, I've gotten to speak with different types of audiences. So STEM faculty who are designing interventions, funders in the UK who are thinking about their strategy and then its evaluation, a government office in Australia. And they've all asked similar questions of like, how do we be critical about the way we evaluate so that the evaluations are actually contributing to the change we want to see? How do we know we're doing good in the evaluation? And for me, those are questions of legitimacy. And so I've presented and will present now a critical systems framework, but also in connection with relational systems thinking, which comes from Indigenous thought. So I'll get into that in a few minutes. But first, I want to put the question for you. So how do you know that evaluation is the right thing to do? This may or may not overlap with what you were thinking, but oftentimes when we think of evaluation and what makes evaluation the right thing to do, we think about the methods themselves and the idea of evidence building and generating knowledge as being an inherent good. It contributes to society, it contributes to policymaking and practice. And so it's a sort of technical rationale of, well, if we use methods well to generate knowledge, then evaluation is the right thing to do or a good thing to do. Those of you, engaged professionally in evaluation or looking to engage in a career in evaluation, oftentimes, if we're fulfilling the contract, if we're working with clients and partners and we're doing what is serving their needs in terms of information or use, then we fulfill this sort of professional obligation around evaluation being the right thing to do. In both Canada and the US, we have really strong professional associations that have ethical guidelines. So those guidelines and standards give us some grounding for how we conduct evaluation and evaluation itself as being a good thing to do that contributes. But the space I want to get into in the discussion today is this moral political rationale. And so in particular, this has taken off in the last few years, but is sort of ripe for discussion again around your particular values. So you might have personal and professional values that intersect with evaluation being a good thing to do. You might have a democratic or a political rationale with regards to democracy and how evaluation serves democracy. You might want evaluation to contribute to equity and justice and have ideas about how evaluation in a particular situation can do that. So in this talk and discussion, what I want to get into is in this moral political rationale, there are these ideas about evaluation being the right thing to do, that it's got this ethical legitimacy. But in reality, in practice, we bring different value perspectives to bear and different worldviews as we engage with different groups in evaluation. And those can sometimes be in conflict or in needing to balance. So this sort of image and icon is going to be woven throughout to illustrate the idea that when we think that evaluation is the right thing to do and we have ideas about how to do evaluation in a particular way, those need to be balanced with other worldviews with regards to a specific evaluation, and that there can be conflict and needs to be space for dialogue between those. And that's what I'm going to get into in a specific case. In my own work in general, yes, as Stuart said, I'm interested in complexity, but I'm particularly interested in social and normative complexity. So when we talk about complexity, we'll talk about the complexity of problems and systems, and sort of this diagnostic idea that the world is complex and problems are complex. And so we need to understand all the causal factors, mechanisms that are at work in order to influence change. But there are also social and normative dimensions of complexity, and these have to do with us as people, but also other types of interests, which I'll talk about, that come to bear in an evaluation process, and the different views, values, norms, worldviews that we bring into that, and how do we negotiate between them so that there can be a collaborative space in evaluation, but also so that we're self-critical, that we're not doing harm in our work inadvertently. The lines in this image I'm going to get into, but inevitably, when we bring different perspectives together, they don't neatly fit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to approach that. But my own background in the systems fields and the system sciences comes from a critical systems orientation. This is one of the foundational scholars of critical systems, C. West Churchman. And this is a short quote, but the systems approach goes on to discovering that every worldview is terribly restricted. So this is the idea that even if you're doing work in service of equity or in particular values and normative ends that you feel are legitimate in themselves, right, that you're highly committed to, there is still a way of being restricted in our worldviews and needing to think about the limits of our own worldview and justification and how those interact together. So I'm going to ground this in a case which I worked on as a researcher, not on the evaluation side. So there was an evaluation team that I'll talk about, some of whom were based in the Amazon. One person was based here in the Northeast in the US. And they were invited and engaged in setting up a monitor and evaluation and learning system in the Amazon. And they were in the very early phase of that. I have another slide in a minute sort of talking about it, but the Amazon is incredibly important ecologically, but also in terms of spirituality, in terms of our knowledge cross-culturally. And there is a need to both restore the Amazon in terms of harm done to the ecosystems, but also restore and lift up, amplify, regenerate Indigenous knowledge in that space. And so this initiative, there's a bioregional plan that has been going on in this time that's recognized between several national governments in terms of how to regenerate in the Amazon, how to protect it. And they were charged with coming up with a monitoring and evaluation learning system to track some of the key indicators over time with regards to the implementation of this bioregional plan. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the plan, but it's available. There's a link. There's some fantastic videos if you look up Cuencas Sagradas in terms of the organization, the partnership, their ongoing work. They were really involved in the COP25 and each one of the international climate change meetings. So if you look them up, you'll find some great, rich information about the background. But what I want to talk about is my work with this evaluation team as they were setting up the MEL system. These are the collaborators in terms of the paper and also the MEL team. So 3 people were based locally and 1 person, the top right, was based here in the Northeast of the US. And they were very interested in both the ecological and Indigenous perspectives coming together with the more traditional evaluation perspective in the setting up of a MEL system and wanting to know, how do we do this ethically? How do we do this responsibly? We don't want to just go in and say, okay, here's what we advise you to do. They wanted to facilitate a participatory process. They knew that even within the local Indigenous communities, there were differences in worldview. Some Indigenous groups had never met and worked together or interacted in terms of the government in this space. There's a lot happening in the context that they wanted to be sensitive to. And at the same time, they had this charge to develop a MEL system. Another layer in this particular case is that there are a lot of different actors, agency people. So there, the government actors, there were different businesses that both were directly involved and then also looking to have their interests furthered in the way that the indicators were set up. There's a handful of local and international non-government organizations, advocacy groups. There are scientific partnerships with academic, research institutes, other scientific institutes, and the different Indigenous communities that I mentioned. So a space that has a lot of plurality in terms of values and perspectives and also worldviews and different ideas about what should count, right? What should go into a MEL system. I'm going to talk about something very initial and preliminary that we did using a combination of relational systems thinking and critical systems heuristics. As I said, I approached this as a researcher, so I was actually working in tandem with them. So the methods listed on the slide on the left here, document review, participatory observation, the interviews I did with the team, I was helping them to make sense of the context of the different actor perspectives in a way that would help them self-reflect on the legitimacy of their work to inform what they did next. And so there were data sources for the case, and then I was using this combination of relational systems thinking and critical systems heuristics as an analytic framework to make sense of what was emerging, what was coming up with regards to some of the tensions. So relational systems thinking, Melanie Goodchild, if there's a fantastic paper that you could also check out, I'll share my slides, or if you just search it, it's open access, that really speaks to this ongoing emphasis, tension, opportunity, but also, potential conflict around bringing together Indigenous and place-based knowledge with Western science. How does that happen? On what basis does it happen? How can it be done in a way that doesn't do harm to Indigenous, not just doesn't do harm, but how can these different worldviews come together in a way that is regenerative and restorative of Indigenous knowledge? And I'm going to get again more into this in the case in a little bit. But in this paper, they really argue for this idea of unconditional love at the basis. So there's sort of an assumption in my work and in this case and in the MEL team that I worked with that there is value in bringing Western science and Indigenous knowledge together, but that value needs to come from this place of love and relationality within that dialogue, and that having the dialogue, having the reflection across difference is fundamental and important. So that idea really aligns well with critical systems heuristics, which is why we combined these two frameworks. I'm going to go through critical systems heuristics in a little more depth. This is a framework I've used, a lot of times and worked with different collaborators to use, including funders, as I mentioned. And it's really a series of questions about boundaries. And I'm going to talk about what boundaries are, but when we think about our own values and worldviews that we bring into an evaluation context, we make assumptions about what's important and what's not important. We make assumptions about who should be there, who should benefit, which then inadvertently excludes others. There are a series of boundaries that inevitably influence our worldviews and our engagements in evaluation. And this framework is a way to make those boundaries explicit, to reflect on them, and to talk together about, are these the right boundaries we want to use? It's particularly useful in setting up a system or critiquing an existing system. So that made sense, again, and aligned with the MEL system at this point. So yeah, boundaries are a bit abstract. We'll talk about some examples of them, but they are choices. They are these markers around what's included and excluded. We could think about them as decisions. We could think about them as lenses, but oftentimes they're implicit and invisible. And so the idea is to name them and look at them critically. The important thing about boundaries in terms of ethics is that they have consequences. So if we don't think about them and deliberate about them and make boundary choices critically, then that's when we can be unaware and do inadvertent harm and contribute to exclusion in a way that might harm us or have future harm without our awareness. So some example of boundaries are community. Right? Community is a word that is used, and often it's like, who are we talking about? Who are we not talking about? Decision makers. We're going to look at decision makers within the framework. Outcomes, what counts as short-term, intermediate, or long-term, but what counts as an outcome or not an outcome. Those are all types of boundaries. What counts as credible evidence can also be a boundary in terms of what knowledge matters and is considered relevant. So those are just a couple examples. You might be familiar with the sort of formal concept of boundaries, or just informally, this idea that, okay, we can only attend to certain things in reality at a time. We can't consider all perspectives, so we have to set some boundaries. How do we do that? I want to sort of put this question back to you again. Are there boundaries that immediately come to mind? They could be those that I mentioned or others that influence your work. What are some of the key boundaries you think influence your work? And then who typically sets those boundaries? Okay, so let me first make the case that boundaries are ethical, or at least outline the case a little bit, because when we think about boundaries, even in my own training as an evaluator, oftentimes they were technical. So, what counts as good data or what counts as quality data, and data being then the way that we build knowledge has to do with methods, and usually there's norms within the methods. So that's sort of a technical rationale. The boundary gets set within the technical and methodological space. In terms of particular evaluation theories and models, like a collaborative approach has ideas about what collaboration looks like within an evaluation process. That could have a technical justification, meaning if you want to implement a collaborative evaluation, you need to adhere to the requirements of collaborative process. Professional, I mentioned those already, but oftentimes that has to do with fulfilling the contract, maintaining a good relationship with the funders, making sure that us individually and our teams and organizations are honoring the RFP, are working within the parameters set out so that we can continue to have that client relationship with the funder, but we can do work that, again, is useful to the funder or the commissioners as audiences. So oftentimes in my own training and the way that I have learned about and also observed in evaluation is that we think about what the right thing to do is through the lens of oftentimes social science research and evaluation training as professionals. And we don't really engage with the idea of them being ethical choices. But in critical systems, boundaries are considered ethical. And it's not just about fulfilling purposes in RFPs or within existing contracts, or even what we would want as the evaluation team, or what a particular group of people would want. We actually have to think about the underlying difference in purposes and interests. And whenever there are multiple purposes and interests, that's different ideas about goodness and rightness. So it puts us in an ethical territory. As I mentioned before, depending on those choices, there can be side effects and unintended consequences. And there's an idea that even if we're working in an evaluation, we are still responsible or have some responsibility for the potential consequences that our work have, right? Immediately and over the longer term. Depending on who's excluded, and especially if there's a historic or ongoing exclusion of different people and issues in a specific context, then without interrogating the boundaries, we can actually exacerbate and contribute to a perpetuation of particular groups being treated poorly or discounting their knowledge or their experience. We can reinforce power and privilege dynamics that are already in place. So if you don't critique them and alter them, then oftentimes evaluation is in a privileged position. We are in a privileged position as evaluators. We have some power and authority, and without critiquing that and redistributing that, we reinforce it. And then there's this idea practically that if we don't look at boundaries, or I could say it in the inverse, if we do look at boundaries, we can identify who might disagree with our work. So when we think about credibility in relation to evaluation, credibility relates to boundaries as well. So people will see evaluation as credible if they agree with some of the choices made in the evaluation, and then they can trust that the findings or the evaluation results. But when we think about boundary critique and the limits of it, we can identify who or what might oppose our work. And this will become a bit more concrete as I go through the application of the framework in this case. So in my work and thinking over time, I was really bought into and persuaded by the idea of boundaries being important, especially when we acknowledge complexity of perspective and norms. And at the same time, it felt like impossible. Like there's so many different types of boundaries being set in an evaluation. How do we know which ones to critique? And so the critical systems framework really lays those out and has 4 categories of boundaries. The first 3 have to do with those involved. And so we're not just thinking about literal people and groups involved, but we want to engage with assumptions, boundary assumptions in the worldviews that those people bring to an evaluation. And so there are boundaries around motivation, power, and knowledge. And I will talk through these. And then there's this sort of deeper idea of legitimacy in the critical systems framework. And legitimacy is boundaries around that relate to the views of those affected, but not just in the present. It could be future generations. It could be non-human, like ecology or other species, other types of actors. Those are also in the legitimacy space in terms of them being affected, but not necessarily having immediate voice in the environment or in the evaluation context. So the idea is in critical systems, to move between each of these 4 categories and interrogate what is the boundary that we think is right, or that someone else thinks is right, and what do each of us think should be. We move between this descriptive and normative space for each. And the idea is to critique, to raise them, to critique them, and then to critically set the boundaries that might shape, in this case, the MEL system. So the way I applied this in the case was to start with the MEL team to ask them some questions around. So we applied critical systems, that framework, then to the setting up of a MEL system. So I was asking the MEL team, what do they think the purpose of a MEL monitoring system should be? What do they think? Each of the questions I'll go through. So I looked at it in terms of the MEL team, in terms of one of the NGOs. This was the partner, Cuencas Sagradas was the partner NGO with the MEL team on the ground, but they were representing a lot of different constituencies. And then the local indigenous peoples in the Amazon. And the MEL team were the main group that I interviewed and interacted with, but they had interactions with the other two groups, and each of the other two groups are quite plural. But together we were trying to name the boundaries that each of these groups valued most. And then in the middle, find some balance, right? Say, how do we bring these together? Instead of just going in as the MEL team and saying, here's the boundaries that are going to set up this MEL system, how instead are we going to create and set boundaries that are going to honor the different worldviews that are, that need to be brought together in this particular case? So that's sort of like the premise or the idea. And then the practicality of it is that it's questions. Like there are 12 questions and you answer them. You can answer them in the descriptive and normative mode from different views, but the power is in the answers and the juxtaposition of the answers, and also in the ordering of the questions. They get deeper and deeper into things that we usually do not talk about in question. So these are the main questions. What is the purpose? Who should benefit? And what does success mean? And as I said, you ask them in two modes. What is the case and what should be the case? And when I first spoke with the MEL team, they have a very systems and complexity orientation to their work. They said this indicator MEL system is really useful for adaptive learning and management. We need to manage ecologically the bioregion over time and also the different constituencies working together. And a MEL system can help inform adaptive learning and management over time. And that was a great purpose, right? They thought, okay, that's really important for the MEL system. The NGO, though, when we engaged with them around the purpose for the MEL system, they actually wanted the MEL system to help them demonstrate external accountability to funders and to the national government and in the short term. So they were not immediately saying, oh, yes, let's build an elaborate MEL system that's going to help us track change over the next decade and multiple decades. They were saying we need to bring more money into the region toward the causes that we're working for and toward. And we need to appease the funders already that are working with us or already investing. And we also need to honor the national governments, but we need to do that in quite the short term, meaning we need to set the MEL system up soon, and we need to get data on the things we decide to track soon so that we can fulfill that initial request, those initial requests. But there's some conflict you can see, right, between those two purposes. And then the third purpose from the Indigenous people's perspective, and again, I'm going to speak generally for the exercise, there was a very long-term perspective, but also an immediate perspective, a mix of both. And there was this idea that, over generations and generations over time, there has been so much through colonization and through the harm done to the ecological environment, the place, that there's a need to restore Indigenous security and sovereignty and their own ability, rights, power, agency to determine what their life course, right? Their culture, their life course within that space. So from an Indigenous perspective in this particular case, the idea was we would like the MEL system to redistribute the power to us, being the Indigenous communities, so that we can determine and govern our future in this space. So just when asking, why do we need a MEL system? What is it for? In that motivation bucket, and who should benefit? There are sort of these different ideas that are brought to bear in the case that are surfaced through critical systems. But the idea then is, how does the MEL team, the evaluation team, not just inflict and use theirs? How do they actually find a space where those can come together? And in the paper, we tried to reflect on a possibility of where those could come together. So under motivation, there's not really a clear answer, but the idea is that there needs to be a balance across those three purposes in terms of the pacing and the dedication and the time to set up the MEL system, and the timeframes in terms of both what's captured and when it's analyzed to report back. And so it's not a sort of great synergy space, but again, the idea is that instead of the MEL team just inflicting where they were coming from, the idea is to ensure that each of the boundaries in each of those perspectives are brought together. So knowledge is another one that evaluators usually have authority. Like, we know how to get data, we know how to analyze, get data, we have ideas about who and what counts as an expert. And so the knowledge category looks at boundaries around experts and expertise, and again, interrogates difference there and how do we bring them together. So the MEL team, they already had a lot of ideas because this is a team that has expertise in bioregional sustainability, in the different types of things that need to be monitored and tracked. My background is not in environmental science, but in terms of climate change and ecological indicators, they had that expertise. And they also had expertise on participatory governance around regeneration. So they already had a lot of ideas of, like, they could propose as a team an indicator list that should be monitored, that already had a lot of backing and that had alignment with the government. So they were walking in thinking, okay, we have a lot of expertise around what needs to get measured or what needs to get included. But the NGO they were not leading with that sort of scientific backing. They were leading with a historical account of the relationships, the politics, the tensions, the different groups within the Amazon, and how many different considerations would need to be brought into bear, but also how different things that might be captured in the MEL system would be perceived and used. So they were bringing that in, which is like another form of knowledge needs to be honored in the development of the MEL system. And then one of the members visited. So it was everybody but me on the team actually were together in person, spending time with the Indigenous communities there and really understanding sort of the idea of cosmology, dreams, and knowledge that comes from dreams, and also place-based knowledge. And this is in the relational systems thinking article as well. This idea of place having knowledge and the idea of ecological wisdom. Those were the types of things that were really valued and that needed to be brought in as well. So just in terms of what's captured around expertise in the MEL system, it was, how do we bring these three things together? I chose to illustrate this one in our time because this is a juxtaposition, I think, that shows up repeatedly in cross-cultural evaluation work, at least in other cases that I've looked at. So yeah, in terms of diverse ways of knowing, it was a different starting point to think about the types of indicators and things that should be captured, but also the idea of different uses and times frames for uses. How do you balance those? Okay, so the framework goes all the way into this idea of legitimacy, and the sort of couple of things I want to say about this, which is, hard to do in a shorter presentation, but when we get underneath our worldviews, there's an idea around emancipation. So when evaluators and funders come together to make change or to work toward change in a community, we have to ensure that there is freedom from our own worldviews being inflicted on a place and on a people. And so in this particular context, the idea of legitimacy means that even though both the MEL team and the local NGOs have quote unquote good intentions, right, and are working for the same big cause, there is an important emphasis on needing to center Indigenous knowledge. And there's a concept called buen vivir that they ended up using as this sort of basis of legitimacy that is a way of articulating the honoring of the ecology and the Indigenous knowledge together with this sort of future perspective to bring future generations in. And so whenever they were then having the conversation about, is this evaluation the right thing to do? Is this a good thing to do in the MEL system, especially given limited resources and conflicting agendas? Instead of the MEL team continuously to say, yes, we need MEL for adaptive learning and management, and the NGO saying, yes, we need MEL to appease the funders, there was sort of this deeper ethos of buen vivir that could be centered and say, we're using the MEL system to honor this idea of buen vivir, and that might take a longer time frame, but we're doing it in a way that's trying to sweep in and bring together these different perspectives and worldviews. Yes, and I mentioned this. So for legitimacy, more than inclusion and dialogue, centering the voices of those most affected in the bioregion. And then they had this, in this case, they have this concept called buen vivir that really worked as the sort of moral source of legitimacy. So as a takeaway, how do you know the evaluation is the right thing to do? Part of what I'm pushing for is to name and discuss the boundaries that shape the work and to think critically about who's included and excluded based on those boundaries. And then I have some tips here for evaluators and those of you who are evaluation students. The sort of base tip is to not just follow the RFP, which I know sounds easier to say than do, but it's to actually question whether the boundaries set in the RFP are appropriate and whether they really do justice to the different perspectives and worldviews in the context. To listen for and ask about purpose, power, knowledge, and legitimacy. So you can formally ask the questions like I did, but you can also listen and ask for them informally. So you can use them to help expand your own thinking about your assumptions and others' assumptions with regards to the evaluation. The idea is also to construct a scope inclusively with care for consequences. So instead of just sort of beginning the line of work, it's actually to think critically about the scope and then have that inclusive basis for it. And then in this particular case, it was a somewhat surprising lesson because the MEL team had such great intentions and expertise, but they had to be open to the fact that the MEL system, there's more that matters than evaluation, right? Maybe that sounds obvious as well, but sometimes we tend to think evaluation is such a great contribution, and there are things that can be more important in the immediate than evaluation. There are some more tips around what to do as collaborators, which you can see. And then there are some tips for funders and commissioners. Like I said, we've worked with those groups as well. And a lot of the tips for funders and commissioners is to be prepared, because when you go through a critical systems heuristics exercise, it is highly unlikely everybody's going to agree. You're going to surface dissent, and you might surface things in this bottom bullet, pushback, trade-offs, and even anger. And so it takes time, and it's not a sort of easy process, but you end up with a stronger basis of legitimacy for the strategy or for the work that you're doing. In here, there are a bunch of links. So this is based on my work, but also others' work. So there's a great places to learn more if you're interested.